Thank you very much. For those of you who didn't get a chance to make points from the floor, we are obviously allowing points of information for the final two speeches. Now to conclude for the proposition this evening, I'm delighted to introduce William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig is one of the US's foremost religious apologists and is here in the UK this week as part of his Reasonable Faith Tour. Dr. Craig, thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to summarize the House's case in favor of the proposition this evening. Now, as already noted earlier, the proposition is oddly worded in a negative way. Belief in God is not a delusion. In order to carry that proposition, all we need to show is that belief in God is intellectually permissible, that it's rational to believe in God, that this is a viable option for a thinking man or woman today. By contrast, the opposition has taken on the enormous burden of proof of having to show that everyone who believes in God is literally deluded. Now, have they offered any good arguments to think that that is the case? Well, as I listened to Andrew's speech, I heard only two arguments in favor of God's being a delusion. The first was to provide a sort of history of religions about how people come to believe in gods. Now, if that is meant to be an argument against the existence of God, this is almost a textbook example of the genetic fallacy. What is that? The genetic fallacy is trying to invalidate a person's position or belief by showing how it originated, how he came to believe it. And that's clearly logically fallacious. I may have come to believe that the Earth is round by reading it in a comic book. That would hardly be good justification, but does that mean that belief is therefore false? Well, obviously not. So the first argument is worthless, ladies and gentlemen. It is a literal logical fallacy. What about the second argument he gave? Well, these gods are like us, he said. That is a good argument against polytheism, as I suggested. But this is not a good argument against the traditional concept and belief in God, which is the belief in a metaphysically necessary, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being. There could hardly be something less like us than that sort of being. So again, the argument simply doesn't hold water. Now, notice those are the only arguments that the opposition has offered tonight for showing that belief in God is a delusion. That's it. And neither one of them is compelling. On the other hand, we have offered arguments in favor of God's existence. First, the moral argument, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist, but some objective moral values exist, therefore God exists. And I was astonished to hear the response of the opposition to this. Their view is that there literally are no objective moral values. On their view, on their naturalistic view, moral values are just the products of socio-biological evolution which have been ingrained into us and which we therefore accept, much as a troop of chimpanzees or even elephants, which exhibit this sort of social behavior. Yes?
Seeing as you're using animals here.
Yes.
Are objective moral values only related to humans? Can they not also be related to animals? If they're objective, do they not relate to all of existence? And therefore, are you sort of, should there be a qualification saying are objective moral values in the mind of man, as opposed to, therefore God exists in the mind of man, as opposed to he exists totally?
Yeah. Animals are not moral agents. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it doesn't rape her. Because you see, none of these things is obligatory or forbidden. And it's the same on naturalism for human beings. These are just ingrained socio-biological patterns of behavior that evolution has put into us. But they're not objectively binding. The rapist who chooses to flout the herd morality is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably. He's the sort of moral equivalent of Lady Gaga, out of step with the herd. But there really are no objective moral values on this view. Now think of what that means. That means that an atrocity like the Holocaust wasn't really wrong. It was just against the herd morality. But as Darwin himself pointed out, if you rewound the film of human evolution and started anew, a very different type of creature might have emerged with very different set of values. And it would be guilty of speciesism for us to think that our values are objectively binding and true, and that other creatures' values are false. So on the naturalistic atheistic view, there really are no objective moral values. But as Peter explained, you cannot explain things like fallibilism, the self-refuting nature of subjectivism, which says we ought to believe in subjectivism, which is a moral ought about epistemic duties, the proper basicality of our moral beliefs. I'll take the question later. So I think we've got good grounds for believing in objective moral values. And if you agree with me that some things are really right and wrong, like torture, raping a little child, hurting someone for fun, then you should agree with the House that God exists. Now let me go on to the contingency argument. This has not been refuted tonight, that God is the best explanation for why anything exists rather than nothing. And the ontological argument. It might surprise you to know that the majority of philosophers today are agreed that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows necessarily and logically that God exists. What the atheist has to maintain, therefore, is not simply that God doesn't exist. He has to argue that it is impossible that God exists, that the concept of God is incoherent, like a married bachelor or a round square. But as Peter pointed out, the concept of God seems to be a perfectly coherent concept. Finite beings like ourselves exemplify moral goodness, knowledge, and power, and there's nothing about extrapolating these to infinity that would make them incoherent. He also points out that the concept of God is intuitively a coherent idea. And finally, Peter pointed out that the other two arguments we gave also lead to the existence of a metaphysically necessary and good being, so that these arguments also suggest that God's existence is at least possible.
Referring back to what you were saying previously about the ontological argument,
yes.
All you're essentially doing is like Gornimo said, you're defining something into existence. You're simply saying, as Kant said, although Mr. Williams ridiculed, is you're describing something like red, blue, round, square, and then you're saying exists is a similar property. You're defining existence as a predicate of something. Existence isn't a predicate. It's not a description of something. It is something that is over and above that object. And by you repeatedly defining something as beyond our conception of everything, you're referring to this same laborious ontological proof, which says that God is beyond us. We can't conceive of him.
Oh, no, I think we can conceive of God. You've got to at least characterize the argument accurately. And Peter and I agree with you that existence is not a property. But necessary existence is a property. And the idea of a being which is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect in every possible world is an intuitively coherent idea. And so it follows that God's existence is either possible or it's impossible. Take your pick. Now what this means is that the opposition must show that you are literally deluded if you think that God's existence is even possible. If you even think that it's possible that God exists, then according to the opposition, you're deluded. That's all we need to show, is that it's possible that God exists, and then it follows that he does. So it seems to me in conclusion that we've got very good arguments for God's existence, two of which haven't even been addressed by the opposition. And this leaves us in a rather awkward situation. Arif Ahmed is going to get up in a moment and lay into the contingency argument, the ontological argument, and we won't have a chance to respond because Andrew chose not to do so in his first speech. That's not proper debate etiquette. You're supposed to respond to the affirmatives case in the opening speech. So, what does Arif need to do in his final speech? What he needs first to do is to give us some reason to think that belief in God is delusory, that everyone who believes in God is suffering from a delusion. Secondly, he needs to respond to each one of those three arguments that we gave and show why it is delusory to believe in the premises of those arguments. Unless and until he does that, I think that we should stick with the House's resolution that belief in God is not delusory. Now, in conclusion, although Peter and I have argued for God's existence tonight, the question before us this evening really isn't, does God exist? The question is belief in God a delusion? And those are two very different questions. You may not believe that God exists, but that doesn't mean you think that everybody who does is therefore suffering from a delusion. You recognize there are many gifted and brilliant thinkers who do believe in God, and it would be presumptuous of you to judge them as deluded. So I think people can disagree with each other respectfully without calling each other deluded. I'll take your point of order.
I was speaking with a psychology student the other day who was telling me that when you measure the brainwaves of someone who is actually deluded and the brainwaves of someone who is fervently religious, they match up to an extraordinary degree.
I'm not aware of those studies, but clearly you cannot judge the content, the propositional content of a belief as to its truth value by brain activity. Brain activity is just electrical activity in the nervous system. It doesn't have propositional content. To determine truth or falsity of propositional content, you need arguments. So we mustn't appeal to brainwave activity to try to invalidate theism. You've got to deal with the arguments. Now, in a few minutes, we're all going to walk through one of two doors to register our opinion on tonight's question. Some of us will walk through the door saying yes, others will walk through the door saying no. Which door you choose makes a profound statement about you personally. Through the one door will walk not only theists of different varieties, Christians, Muslims, Jews, other sorts of theists, but also agnostics. Agnostics who think it's an open question whether God exists. And many, if... Yes?
Might agnostics walk through the abstention door in the middle?
No, because it... No. If the debate topic tonight were, does God exist? Right through that center door, the agnostic would go. But the question is God a delusion? And agnostics, because they're open, they don't know whether God exists. They can't say it's a delusion for everyone who believes in God. Agnostics will join the theists in walking through the door marked I. In fact, many, if not most, atheists will walk through the door marked I. They may disagree with their theistic friends about the existence of God, but they're not prepared to judge all of their believing friends as literally deluded. They recognize that the existence of God is a difficult question on which rational opinion can vary. Peter and I haven't indicted our opponents tonight as being deluded. We think they're mistaken, but we wouldn't say they're deluded. Why can't they return the favor? People can disagree without calling each other names. So, by voting with the House, you show yourself to be open-minded, tolerant of a diversity of opinion on difficult questions, and also respectful of the beliefs of others. By contrast, in voting with the opposition, you, in effect, declare that all of your believing friends and professors are literally deluded and irrational. So which door are you going to pick? I hope that you're not that judgmental. I hope you're not that cocksure of yourself. I hope that you will join believers in voting with the House this evening and agreeing that whether belief in God is true or false, those who believe in God are not deluded. That belief in God is not a delusion.